The coffee was still warm when they found her car, engine running, door open, keys dangling in the ignition, but Ellen Green was gone. What police discovered in that abandoned Honda Accord outside Chicago's most dangerous housing project would launch a 25-year mystery, a mystery that wouldn't be solved until DNA evidence, a terrified witness, and a shallow grave beneath a demolished playground finally revealed the dark secret that had been buried alongside a dedicated social worker who had simply been trying to help. But the truth was far more sinister than anyone imagined. Because the person who killed Ellen Green hadn't just taken her life. He'd spent decades hiding in plain sight, walking past her grieving mother in church, attending memorials in her honor, all while knowing exactly where her body lay, buried in the Chicago soil. This is the story of Ellen Marie Green, a woman who vanished in broad daylight, a mother who never stopped searching, and a killer who almost got away with murder. Hit subscribe if you believe everyone should be treated fairly. Only haters, manipulators, and trolls won't subscribe. If you believe people should be treated fairly, hit subscribe. Trolls won't. Comment "I stand for justice" if you're not siding with the bully. Ellen Marie Green, 32 years old, had left her office at the Cook County Department of Children and Family Services at 3:47 that afternoon, September 23, 1993. She had told her supervisor, Patricia Romano, that she was making one final home visit before the weekend, a routine welfare check on a family in the Robert Taylor Homes, Unit 1147, Building 4. She was expected back at the office by 5:30. She never returned. The Robert Taylor Homes, stretching like concrete monuments along State Street, housed over 25,000 residents across 28 high-rise buildings. Completed in the early 1960s as a solution to Chicago's housing crisis, the complex had by the 1990s become synonymous with poverty, gang violence, and urban decay. It was a place where social workers like Ellen Green represented a lifeline for struggling families, and also a place where asking the wrong questions could have deadly consequences. Ellen had worked for DCFS for 8 years, since graduating with her master's in social work from the University of Illinois at Chicago in 1985. She was known among colleagues as thorough, compassionate, and perhaps dangerously dedicated. She didn't clock out when cases got complicated. She didn't look away when families fell through bureaucratic cracks. Her caseload that fall included 47 families, most concentrated in the South Side housing projects. Among them was the Morrison family in Unit 1147, a mother with 3 children under the age of 10, living in conditions that had triggered multiple reports from teachers and neighbors. Ellen had visited the unit twice before in August, documenting concerns about inadequate food, unsanitary conditions, and the presence of unidentified adults in the home. When Ellen failed to return to the office by 6 o'clock that evening, Patricia Romano made the first of several increasingly worried phone calls. By 7:15, she contacted the Chicago Police Department to report a missing social worker. The response was slower than it should have been. A missing adult, even one whose absence seemed unusual, didn't trigger immediate alarm in a city where dozens of people disappeared daily amid violence and chaos. Officer Marcus Webb arrived at the Robert Taylor Homes at 8:43 that evening. He found Ellen's Honda Accord exactly where witnesses said it had been parked since approximately 4 p.m. that afternoon. Driver's door still ajar, keys in the ignition, purse and briefcase inside. The car showed no signs of struggle. Nothing appeared stolen. It was as if Ellen had simply stepped away for a moment and vanished into the September dusk. The Morrison family, when questioned, claimed Ellen had never arrived. Cassandra Morrison, the mother Ellen had come to see, insisted no social worker had knocked on her door that afternoon. Her children, when interviewed separately, gave varying accounts. The oldest, an 8-year-old boy named Marcus Jr., initially said a lady with red hair had come to the door, but his mother quickly corrected him, saying he was confused, thinking of a different day. Ellen Green had light brown hair, not red, but something about the child's statement and the mother's immediate intervention struck Officer Webb as significant. He noted it in his report, but in the chaos of managing a missing person case in one of Chicago's most dangerous neighborhoods, the detail was filed away rather than pursued. Ellen's disappearance shattered her small family. Her mother, Dorothy Green, 61, lived in Evanston and had spoken to Ellen just that morning about weekend plans. Her father had died 6 years earlier, and Ellen was Dorothy's only child. The two spoke daily, shared dinners twice a week, and maintained the kind of close relationship that made Ellen's sudden absence incomprehensible. Dorothy Green spent the first 72 hours after Ellen disappeared calling hospitals, police stations, and anyone who might have information. She contacted every family on Ellen's caseload, drove through the Robert Taylor Homes herself, despite warnings from police, and distributed hundreds of photocopied flyers with Ellen's photograph across the South Side. The initial investigation was conducted by Detective Raymond Price of Area 1 Violent Crimes. He interviewed Ellen's colleagues, reviewed her recent case files, and attempted to map her movements on September 23rd. What emerged was a portrait of a dedicated professional whose work had inevitably brought her into contact with people living on society's margins, including some involved in criminal activity. Ellen's case notes from her previous visits to the Morrison unit documented concerns that went beyond neglect. She had observed what she suspected were drug transactions occurring in the common areas of Building 4. She had noted the presence of a man named Vincent Lattimore, who claimed to be Cassandra Morrison's brother, but whose presence in the unit violated housing authority regulations and raised questions about his relationship to the family. Vincent Lattimore, 29 years old in 1993, had a criminal record that included arrests for drug possession, assault, and weapons charges, though most had resulted in plea deals or dismissals. He lived officially in Building 7 of the Robert Taylor homes, but neighbors reported he spent significant time in Unit 1147, often acting as if he controlled the space. Ellen's case notes from August 19th included a carefully worded entry that read, "Observed male subject, mid to late 20s, approximately 6 feet tall, athletic build, conversing with multiple individuals in hallway outside Unit 1147. Subject appeared to be conducting transactions. Children from Unit 1147 present during observation. Will recommend increased monitoring and possible referral to Housing Authority for unauthorized occupants." 2 days after Ellen's disappearance, Detective Price attempted to interview Vincent Lattimore. Lattimore claimed he'd been at a friend's apartment in Englewood on September 23rd and knew nothing about any missing social worker. His alibi was provided by associates whose credibility was questionable, but without physical evidence or witnesses placing Lattimore at the scene, Price couldn't build a case. The investigation was complicated by the environment in which it occurred. The Robert Taylor homes operated under its own codes of silence. Residents who witnessed crimes rarely spoke to police, either from fear of retaliation or distrust of law enforcement. Even those sympathetic to Ellen's disappearance were reluctant to provide information that might put them at risk. Cassandra Morrison changed her story 3 times in the weeks following Ellen's disappearance. Initially claiming Ellen never arrived, she later admitted Ellen had knocked on the door, but said she'd been told to come back another day. In a third interview, Morrison broke down crying and said she'd let Ellen into the apartment, that Ellen had spoken briefly with the children and then left after 15 minutes. But Morrison couldn't or wouldn't explain why she'd initially lied, and her timeline didn't match the evidence of Ellen's car sitting abandoned for hours. By November 1993, the investigation had stalled. Detective Price had compiled a thick file of interviews, timelines, and theories, but no concrete evidence pointing to Ellen's fate. The prevailing theory was that she had witnessed something, criminal activity or violence, and had been killed to ensure her silence. But without a body, without witnesses, without physical evidence, the case remained frustratingly unresolved. The Cook County Department of Children and Family Services conducted its own internal review of Ellen's disappearance. The review identified systemic failures in protocols for social workers making visits to high-risk locations. Recommendations were made for paired visits, better communication systems, and increased security measures. But budget constraints meant most recommendations were never implemented. Ellen's case was officially classified as a homicide investigation in January 1994, based on the length of her absence and the circumstances of her disappearance. But active investigation efforts diminished as new cases demanded attention and resources. By 1995, Ellen Green's file had been transferred to the Cold Case Unit, joining hundreds of other unsolved disappearances and murders in Chicago. Dorothy Green refused to accept that her daughter's case would simply fade away. She maintained contact with the police department, called monthly to ask about progress, and continued distributing flyers years after most people had forgotten Ellen's name. She attended city council meetings to advocate for better protection for social workers. She wrote letters to newspapers, politicians, and anyone who might help keep Ellen's case alive. The Robert Taylor homes continued its slow decline through the 1990s. The complex that had once been envisioned as a pathway to better living had become a symbol of failed public housing policy. Gang violence escalated. Maintenance deteriorated. Families who could leave did so, and those who remained were often the most vulnerable and isolated. In 1999, the Chicago Housing Authority announced plans to demolish the Robert Taylor homes as part of a broader transformation of public housing. The demolition would take years, but it signaled the end of an era. For Dorothy Green, it also meant the possible destruction of any evidence related to her daughter's disappearance. Building 4, where Ellen had been heading the day she vanished, was scheduled for demolition in 2001. Before the implosion, Dorothy Green walked through the abandoned structure one final time. Accompanied by a sympathetic police officer who had maintained interest in the case. They found nothing. The units had been stripped, the hallways were empty, and whatever secrets the building held were about to be reduced to rubble. The demolition of Building 4 occurred on a cold March morning in 2001. Explosive charges brought the structure down in a controlled collapse that took less than 30 seconds. Dust billowed across the south side, and another piece of Chicago's complicated history disappeared. What no one knew at the time was that beneath the playground adjacent to Building 4, in a shallow grave dug hastily in September 1993, Ellen Green's remains had lain undisturbed for 8 years. The playground, built in the 1970s and abandoned by the early 1990s due to safety concerns, had been slated for removal as part of the redevelopment. But funding delays meant the playground equipment sat rusting and forgotten, the ground beneath it never excavated. The years passed. Dorothy Green grew older, her hope for answers dimming but never extinguished. She moved to a smaller apartment in 2003, boxing up Ellen's belongings but unable to discard them. She marked every September 23rd with a private memorial, lighting a candle and speaking aloud to the daughter she'd never stopped mourning. In Chicago's cold case files, Ellen Green's investigation remained technically active, but essentially dormant. The original case files, transferred multiple times as detectives retired and departments reorganized, occupied 3 boxes in a storage facility on the west side. Periodically, a new detective would review the case, make a few phone calls, and conclude there was nothing new to pursue. Vincent Lattimore's life followed a predictable trajectory through the criminal justice system. He was arrested multiple times in the years following Ellen's disappearance, serving short sentences for drug offenses and probation violations. In 2007, he was convicted of aggravated battery and sentenced to 4 years at Stateville Correctional Center. He was released in 2010 with mandatory parole supervision. The breakthrough in Ellen Green's case came not from renewed investigative efforts, but from an unrelated arrest in 2018. Vincent Lattimore, now 54 years old and living in a South Side apartment, was arrested on July 12th following a domestic dispute that escalated to assault. During processing, DNA samples were collected as part of standard procedure for violent offenders. The Cook County Crime Lab, working through a backlog of DNA samples, ran Lattimore's profile through the national database. The system flagged a match to evidence collected 25 years earlier, cigarette butts found on the floor of Unit 1147 in the Robert Taylor homes on September 24, 1993, during the initial investigation into Ellen Green's disappearance. Detective Sarah Chen of the Chicago Police Department's Cold Case Unit received notification of the match on August 3, 2018. She pulled Ellen's file and spent 2 weeks reviewing every document, every interview, every piece of evidence collected a quarter-century earlier. The cigarette butts had been found in an ashtray in the Morrison apartment and had been collected as potential evidence but never analyzed due to budget limitations in 1993. Chen began building a timeline of Lattimore's activities in September 1993. She tracked down former residents of the Robert Taylor homes, now scattered across Chicago and its suburbs. She located Cassandra Morrison, who was living in Roseland under a different name after years of struggles with addiction and poverty. Morrison, now 57 and sober for 3 years, initially refused to speak with Chen. But after several attempts, she agreed to meet at a diner on 95th Street. What she revealed during that conversation, haltingly and with obvious fear even after all these years, provided the missing pieces of Ellen Green's story. Cassandra Morrison admitted that Ellen Green had indeed visited her apartment on September 23, 1993, arriving around 4 in the afternoon as scheduled. Ellen had come inside, reviewed the living conditions, and spoken with the children. During the visit, Vincent Lattimore had been in the back bedroom, a fact Morrison had hidden from Ellen, but which Ellen had discovered when she opened a door looking for the bathroom. Ellen had seen what was in that bedroom. Not just Lattimore, but evidence of significant drug distribution operation, packaging materials, scales, and quantities of narcotics that made clear this wasn't simple personal use. Morrison described Ellen's face when she opened that door, the moment of recognition followed by professional composure as she quickly closed it and returned to the living room. Ellen had told Morrison she needed to leave, but would be returning with police and housing authority officials. She had gathered her briefcase and headed for the door. That's when Lattimore had emerged from the bedroom, realizing his operation had been witnessed by exactly the wrong person, a county official with the authority and legal obligation to report what she'd seen. Morrison's account of what happened next was fragmented by trauma and time. There had been arguing, Lattimore blocking Ellen's exit, Ellen insisting she had to leave, Lattimore becoming increasingly agitated and threatening. Morrison had taken her children to a neighbor's apartment, not wanting them to witness whatever was about to occur. When she returned 30 minutes later, Ellen was gone. The apartment had been cleaned. Lattimore had told Morrison that if she ever spoke about what happened, her children would be taken away, and she would be arrested as an accessory. For 25 years, Cassandra Morrison had carried the knowledge that Ellen Green had been murdered in her apartment, that her silence had allowed a killer to walk free, that her fear had prevented justice. The weight of that knowledge had contributed to years of addiction, mental health crises, and an inability to build stable life. But Chen's arrival and the DNA evidence had finally given her permission to speak the truth she'd been too terrified to tell. Armed with Morrison's statement, Chen obtained a warrant to arrest Vincent Lattimore on September 12, 2018. He was taken into custody without incident at his apartment, showing little surprise when informed of the charges. After consulting with his attorney, Lattimore agreed to provide a statement in exchange for prosecutors agreeing not to seek the death penalty. The interrogation took place on September 14th at Area 1 headquarters. Lattimore, older and weathered by decades of incarceration and street life, seemed almost relieved to finally discuss events he'd carried secretly for 25 years. He confirmed Morrison's account with additional details that only the perpetrator would know. Ellen Green had indeed discovered his drug operation. When she insisted on leaving, he had grabbed her arm. She had pulled away and threatened to call police immediately. In a moment of panic and rage, Lattimore had struck Ellen with a heavy glass ashtray, the same one from which cigarette butts were later collected. The blow had been severe enough to cause immediate loss of consciousness. Lattimore claimed he hadn't intended to kill Ellen, that it had been a spontaneous act driven by fear of arrest and loss of his lucrative business. But his actions after Ellen fell unconscious demonstrated calculated decision-making rather than panic. He had checked for a pulse and found none. He had then spent the next several hours concealing evidence and disposing of Ellen's body, using the cover of darkness and the chaos that was routine in the Robert Taylor homes. Lattimore had wrapped Ellen's body in a tarpaulin and transported it to the abandoned playground behind Building 4. He had spent most of that night digging a shallow grave beneath one of the deteriorating pieces of playground equipment, burying Ellen approximately 4 feet deep in soil that hadn't been disturbed in years. He had then returned to the Morrison apartment, cleaned thoroughly, and disposed of any evidence linking Ellen to the space. Ellen's briefcase and purse had been thrown into a dumpster across the complex. Her car had been left exactly where she'd parked it, keys inside, to create the impression that she had disappeared after parking rather than inside a specific apartment. The location Lattimore described was documented in detail. Satellite imagery from 1993 confirmed the existence of the playground he referenced. Records from the Chicago Housing Authority indicated the playground had been slated for removal multiple times, but had never been demolished due to budget constraints. The equipment had been removed in 2002, but the ground beneath it had never been excavated. On September 20, 2018, a forensic recovery team from the Cook County Medical Examiner's office arrived at the former site of the Robert Taylor homes. The area was now part of a mixed-income redevelopment, with newer apartment buildings and green spaces replacing the high-rises that had once dominated the landscape. The former playground location was now a small park with benches and young trees. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed anomalies in the soil consistent with a burial site. Excavation began at 7 that morning, proceeding with meticulous care to preserve any evidence that might remain after 25 years underground. By noon, the team had uncovered fragments of the tarpaulin Lattimore had described. By 3 hours, they had located skeletal remains positioned exactly as Lattimore had indicated. Dr. Michael Torres, the forensic anthropologist overseeing the recovery, confirmed that the remains were consistent with an adult female, approximately 5 feet 5 inches tall, matching Ellen Green's physical description. Dental records would provide definitive confirmation, but the location, positioning, and physical characteristics left little doubt. Among the remains, investigators found fragments of clothing, a small gold cross necklace that Dorothy Green would later identify as a gift she'd given Ellen on her 30th birthday, and corroded metal from a watch Ellen had worn daily. The evidence painted a picture of a woman buried hastily in the clothes she'd worn to work, treated as if her life and identity meant nothing. Dorothy Green, now 86 years old and living in a nursing facility in Evanston, was notified of the discovery by Detective Chen on September 21st. The conversation was brief. Dorothy had waited 25 years for this news, had never stopped believing her daughter would be found, had maintained faith that truth would eventually emerge. When Chen told her that Ellen had been located, that arrests had been made, that justice was finally possible, Dorothy had simply said, "Thank you. I knew she was waiting to be found." The formal identification through dental records was completed on September 24th, confirming what everyone already knew. The remains recovered from the former playground were those of Ellen Marie Green, missing since September 23, 1993, murdered in the line of duty while trying to protect vulnerable children. Vincent Lattimore was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and concealment of a homicide. His trial was scheduled for April 2019. Cassandra Morrison, after extensive negotiation with prosecutors, agreed to testify in exchange for immunity from prosecution related to her role in concealing the crime. Her testimony would prove crucial in establishing the timeline and circumstances of Ellen's final hours. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Morrison's testimony was emotionally devastating, describing her own fear and complicity, while also making clear that Lattimore had been the sole actor in Ellen's death. Forensic evidence corroborated key details of Lattimore's confession. The DNA match from the cigarette butts placed him at the scene. The location of the remains matched his description precisely. Lattimore's defense attempted to argue that Ellen's death had been accidental, that he had struck her in self-defense when she threatened him, and that his subsequent actions were driven by panic rather than malice. But the prosecution successfully demonstrated that his behavior after Ellen's death showed calculated effort to avoid detection, including threats against Morrison and her children, and maintenance of silence for 25 years. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Judge Patricia Alvarez, sentencing Lattimore on May 17, 2019, imposed a sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole. She noted that Lattimore had not only taken Ellen's life, but had denied her family closure for a quarter-century, compounding his original crime with decades of silence. Dorothy Green attended every day of the trial, accompanied by a small group of Ellen's former colleagues and friends who had never forgotten her. On the day of sentencing, Dorothy provided a victim impact statement that was read aloud by her attorney as her health no longer permitted her to speak for extended periods. The statement described Ellen's dedication to helping families, her compassion for children trapped in impossible circumstances, her belief that everyone deserved dignity and support. It described the 25 years Dorothy had spent searching, hoping, refusing to accept that her daughter would simply disappear without answers. It acknowledged that while justice had finally arrived, it could never restore the years lost or repair the damage done. Ellen's remains were cremated, and a memorial service was held on June 2, 2019, at a small church in Evanston. Former colleagues from the Department of Children and Family Services attended, along with some of the families Ellen had helped during her 8 years of service. Several people spoke about Ellen's impact on their lives, her refusal to give up on difficult cases, her ability to see potential in situations others considered hopeless. Dorothy Green kept Ellen's ashes in an urn in her room at the nursing facility, finally having her daughter close after so many years of separation. She passed away peacefully on December 8, 2019, 7 months after Ellen's memorial service. Those who cared for Dorothy in her final months said she seemed at peace in a way she hadn't been during the previous 25 years, as if Ellen's discovery had finally allowed both of them to rest. The case prompted renewed attention to the safety of social workers in Chicago and nationally. The National Association of Social Workers used Ellen's story to advocate for better protocols, increased security measures, and recognition of the risks faced by professionals working in high-crime areas. Ellen Green's name became associated with legislative efforts to improve protections for social workers, ensuring that her death might prevent future tragedies. The site where Ellen's remains were found was marked with a small memorial plaque in 2020, installed by the Chicago Housing Authority and the Department of Children and Family Services. The plaque reads, "In memory of Ellen Marie Green, 1961-1993, social worker, advocate, and champion for children. She gave her life in service to others." Vincent Lattimore remains incarcerated at Stateville Correctional Center, where he will spend the rest of his life. He has given no interviews, made no public statements, and according to prison records, shows no remorse for his actions. At 56, he has decades of incarceration ahead of him, time to contemplate the moment of rage and fear that destroyed 2 lives and devastated countless others. The former Robert Taylor Homes site has been entirely transformed. Where 28 high-rise buildings once stood, there are now mixed-income developments, parks, and community spaces. Few physical traces remain of the complex that once housed tens of thousands. But the stories remain, and Ellen Green's story stands as a reminder of the human costs of poverty, violence, and systems that failed to protect those trying to help. Ellen's case file, now complete with confession, conviction, and closure, occupies space in the Cook County archives. The boxes contain not just documents and evidence, but the record of a woman who believed in the possibility of making a difference, who faced danger as part of her daily work, and who paid the ultimate price for trying to do what was right. The cold case was closed, justice was served, and Ellen Marie Green was finally laid to rest. But her legacy extends beyond the resolution of her murder. She represents every social worker who enters dangerous situations to help vulnerable families, every professional who chooses service over safety, and every person whose commitment to others costs them everything. In a city where violence often goes unpunished and disappearances remain mysteries, Ellen's case stands as evidence that persistence matters, that truth eventually surfaces, and that even after 25 years, justice can still be found. It came too late for Ellen, and too late for Dorothy, who waited so long for answers. But it came, and in a world where many families never receive closure, that itself is something worth remembering. Hit subscribe if you believe everyone should be treated fairly. Only haters, manipulators, and trolls won't subscribe. If you believe people should be treated fairly, hit subscribe. Trolls won't. Comment, "I stand for justice," if you're not siding with the bully.